Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you are in the world as you watch this. Today, we thought we'd talk about something that is actually at the very core of how we've built the Gajumaru. We talked about this in the past, that we called it the Gajumaru because of this feature, which is that it has a common root, Groot, the open governance-free resource layer that sits at the bottom and allows everything else, all of the innovation to really occur at the associate chain level. And associate chains in this context they don't actually have to be blockchains. They can be databases, they can be SQLs. But the idea really is that we're recognizing that within the real world, we have sovereign nations who have rules and regulations, taxation and accounting practices that need to be done to operate a business in that jurisdiction. So in reality, the idea of associate chains is not just that this pushes the innovation to that level, it's also that it's recognizing that there is a need for regulatory oversight, legislative oversight, and so on. Around that, we've seen a lot of issues in the blockchain space where on the one hand, you have the likes of Christine Lagarde pointing the finger at blockchain as being a tool for money laundering, whilst ignoring the trillions of dollars that are facilitated through the existing banking system, which is much more opaque, which we can come to when we talk about associate chains, because actually that opacity is lent to it by the fact that they're a regulated entity. And that's where that privacy can come from. Now, how they abuse that is a whole other story, which is not our domain of expertise. But when we're looking at how the realities of blockchain work, that everything is traceable unless you do something to fudge that. And we can touch into some of those, just Tornado Cash, tumblers, and so on. But with that, having sort of set the scene, I'm going to throw it over to Ulf to reiterate what the structure is between the associate chains and the core, the resource layer. So this is working off the mnemonic we use, which is RIPA, Resource Infrastructure Platform Application, as a tool set to understand how blockchains actually work from that core resource layer through to the point of the application layer that we as individuals interact with. So Ulf, over to you.
Yeah, right. So we have talked quite a lot about Groot and the fact that it's a classic proof of work, decentralized blockchain, which we use to mint the Gaju as a universal resource. We haven't talked that much about associate chains, partly because we were, for the longest time, waiting for some patent applications to be filed, and we couldn't really talk much about certain details before those had been registered properly. So associate chains are actually connected to the parent chain. At the top level, it's going to be Groot. The connections are a little bit different from gateways, typical blockchain gateways, in a couple of ways. And most of those design decisions are deliberate in order to make them easier to regulate. Because, as we like to put it, decentralized proof of work blockchains are regulation resistant. They make enforcement really hard. They offer something called pseudonymity. It's like everything is essentially transparent, but also privacy is really hard, which we can get into. So with associate chains, the connection point, anyone can create a connection point for an associate chain. It has a list of approver accounts, essentially, that anything that goes in and out of the parent chain to the associate chain has to be signed by a majority of the associate chain operators. We do not do zero knowledge proof rollups or anything, because our assumption is that the the permissionless chain cannot be put in a position to know too much about the associate chain. If the idea is that the responsibility and the regulatory compliance lies with those who operate the associate chain. So those can be banks, for example. And to put them into a position where they have to comply with some complex mathematical proofs on the Groot is going to be just make it so much harder to adopt them, and it's actually not going to provide much value in terms of commercial utility. So essentially, the operators are on the hook if it's a regulated associate chain, and the operators are then typically also known. But this also means that, like Greg said, the associate chain can be a public chain. It can be a public, typically, I guess, a public permission chain run by trusted operators. It could be a private chain or something that just acts like a chain in the interface, but is really, say, a legacy banking system with a clever adapter on it. And so essentially it provides the environment where if you have Gajus on the parent chain, it's a straightforward transaction to move Gajus from the parent chain into an associate chain into your account there. That transfers.
Sorry, let me just pull you back a second a little bit here, because the use of the word parent chain is incorrect here, I think, in that it's not a parent in the classic sense as you see being used in the context of Polygon and Cosmos, because that sort of implies, to people's ears, it might imply that there is a supervisory connection from Groot, the resource layer, to the infrastructure layer, the associate chain. That isn't the case, but there is a specific thing that is different, which is that they're aware of one another, which is very different from the likes of Cosmos and Polygon. So I just want to be careful that people, because those words, a little bit like pool, lots of these things, they get deliberately abused. So I want to be careful that we don't create the perception for the viewer that this is something akin to. There is no control function from Groot to the associate chain.
Right. So you could see the associate chain network as a hierarchy, where an associate chain can itself have connected associate chains and down.
So for example, you could have the country of Kathmandu having an associate chain, and each of the banks that run payment systems, accounts, etc., as regulated entities within that running databases as associate chains within the national blockchain framework, for example.
Yes, and there are several reasons why you might want to do this. I mean, one possibility is that the national chain could implement its own native currency that operates in parallel with the Gaju, and that the associate chains to that chain in its turn, in their turn, they actually see the national chain as the minting master of the native currency. And other reasons to, I mean, you could see, for example, if you're a bank and you want to run an associate chain, it could be a private chain that you use to implement public banking requirements, where you selectively are able to reveal information in a way that's compliant with the laws, and but then allow activity, traceable activity on your local chain. Now, you could also create an associate chain to scale out and have dedicated performance on your chain, or dedicated characteristics that, for example, even if, say you have a high volume traffic and you have different response time requirements from the root chain, or from the chain you're connected to, I guess it would, what would be the, I mean, you could say superior chain too, but as you say, the parent chain or the superior chain in the hierarchy doesn't really control anything except that it verifies that the subordinate chain cannot print money. It cannot create money out of thin air. So you have to, the amount of Gajus you transfer into that associate chain, well, the amount of Gajus that you pull out of the associate chain can never exceed the amount of Gajus that you have transferred into it.
This is
So
true,
that
but
is,
that's the awareness point. But in
yeah,
fact, let's say, for example, Kathmandu were a country and Kathmandu were to decide to implement some sort of digital coin of their own. They would be the mint for that coin. But they then have an exchange issue where they would need to go from that currency to another. Let's say, for example, the Kathmandu pound to the US dollar. The transferring vessel would be the Gaju. And that would
yes.
mean that although that you could do that as an atomic swap, because we talked about this in the past with the example of New Zealand and Canada, that if I were to transfer money from New Zealand to Canada, I would optimally, to do the exchange rate process, I would go New Zealand dollar to Australian dollar to Japanese yen to US dollar to Canadian dollar, in order to hit all the liquidity pools and actually be able to transact and transfer in the most efficient way. Bizarrely. Whereas with the Gaju, you could go New Zealand dollar, Gaju, Canadian dollar, because it creates that global open resource layer in which all of these things can interface. But actually, the transaction could be almost atomic, that you have New Zealand dollar, Gaju, Canadian dollar within the same transactional block. So it occurs in one movement as opposed to multiple steps.
Right. Yeah.
It's
If a given if a given associate chain was participating in the Canadian dollar and the US dollar or whatever, or the Australian dollar and the Gaju, then you have all three right there. It's like,
Well, that
it's a
would be
few seconds.
permissioned, Craig, because what we were saying,
Yes.
in fact, one of the design aspects of the associate chain was that it is natively interoperable, but selectively interconnected, by
Right.
which we mean that the Groot structure makes it natively interoperable. But how an associate chain chooses to permit those within the chain to transact outside of the chain and come into the chain, or it may not be a chain, it may just be an SQL database that they run. But
Mm-hmm.
what can come in and out of that pathway is determined by their rules of connectivity.
Right.
So, for example, if America had its own national associate chain, it would choose to treat a Taiwanese associate chain and Taiwanese dollar differently from a Chinese associate chain and a yuan, or you can just keep rolling that analogy across, because each time where there are different business ties, commercial ties, commercial and business being the same, forgive me, political ties, diplomatic ties, you're going to see slightly different arrangements between them as to what sort of connectivity they will have. So let's come back to a more fundamental thing and try and hone in on this. What does a blockchain actually do? An actual blockchain that actually works. It allows us to trust the message, not the messenger, securely at scale. Now, what we have in the traditional banking system is a process where we trust the messenger. You trust that Royal Bank of Scotland, Bank of Japan, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, whoever it is, that this is a big institution that you can trust. Why can you trust them? Well, they've got brand positioning and a sense of sanctity around them that they see as or so they claim is fundamental to their business case. Of course, that changes when it turns out that they have taken their rent-seeking position, thoroughly abused it to the point that now they're going bankrupt and everyone else has to bail them out. But we'll get past that bit.
I was about to say, why do we trust them? But it's fine.
Actually,
Sake of argument, sure.
Because we don't have choice. That's the thing. What's the other option? Going with gold, physical gold, which is, well, not
super
useful.
hard.
Yeah.
Well, look, why do we have regulation? The answer to why we have regulation is because there's an imbalance of power between those who are given the permission to act in a trusted context, to be the messenger that we trust. And so the idea is, in theory, that the regulator is the ally of the little guy who says, oh, hold on a second, my bank has not accurately maintained the ledger of my accounts, and I now need that to be fixed. That really, in theory, is what regulation is supposed to cover. It's supposed to give assurances to the world that you can trust these guys, because not only do they have this brand that is dependent upon your trust, so they say, but in addition to that, we're actually looking at their accounts. We're supervising how they segregate funds, how they manage everything, how their databases are run. And we can step in and fix this if it turns out that there's a problem. And we can hold them to ransom by saying, if you don't address this problem, we will close down your banking license. Of course, that's a nuclear option. But the point is, the existing financial system is essentially a series of fractured and fragmented infrastructures. Those who get to run those infrastructures are licensed entities. Those who connect those infrastructures are licensed entities, licensed by a regulator or a multiplicity of regulators. And they use that regulated position essentially to be rent seekers in the interconnection and facilitation of trade. You're right, we don't have an alternative choice, Dimitar, because as it stands, Bitcoin is a wonderful proof of concept for a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, but it doesn't actually work as such. Everything else is a fake blockchain. If it's proof of stake, it's fake. That's the simple rule. Anonymous proof of stake is a gameable system, and the assumption that nobody's gaming it when the actors involved are Binance, Coinbase, and Larry Fink is, let's just say, hopelessly optimistic.
So I guess we could also, as a fresh example of this, we have the recent verdict in the United States, where Roman Storm, who was one of the founders of Tornado Cash, was convicted for, I don't know, what was it? He was essentially conspiring to operate an unlicensed money transfer operation. And there has been a lot of confusing publicity about that. Some have argued that this is basically criminalizing open source development, because all he did was write some clever contracts that could be used for privacy. But they actually did more than that. They launched a special coin and a special ecosystem essentially on top of blockchains like Ethereum to make it possible to anonymize money transfers or token transfers. And as it happened, a lot of the activity that many of the actors that actually used Tornado Cash were criminals or governments that didn't necessarily want or wanted to meddle in other governments' affairs in a way that wasn't traceable. And a big aspect of why they were convicted what's called willful acceptance, that they were actually making money from the torn coin, and they were making more money as traffic increased. And so when you profit from illegal activity and you basically say that, well, that wasn't my intention, but hey, this is kind of cool,
Well,
you are
hold on.
essentially on the hook legally.
Come back to something else that you pointed out in the discussion on this that we had prior to coming on to the chat today. In actual fact, the Tron, oh, it's not Tron, that's another discussion. The Tornado Cash founders allocated themselves very large amounts of the staking token that ran the so-called decentralized autonomous organization, which we've touched on before, that the vast majority of them are not decentralized in any way, shape, or form. They are merely a tool for pretending that something is decentralized, in much the same way that people are using so-called layer ones to pretend that something is decentralized when clearly they aren't. Solana, Definity, for example. The egregious part in this was actually that they did have governance. They had control through the DAO of what could or could not happen on the chain. It wasn't governance free. It wasn't open, as has been claimed. So that part is an important component of what you posted about this.
So arguably, if you want to make something that is actually useful on a public decentralized chain, this is what you need to do. You need to provide some kind of platform on top that ensures that things are actually working well. And you need to market it. You need to probably attract some investors. You need to make sure that, for example, in the case of Tornado Cash, that you have relay agents that are you need to reach some volume in order for it to be properly anonymized and stuff like that. So you actually have to work at creating an ecosystem. And then essentially you cannot afterwards claim that you have no responsibility. This that you created being used by illicit actors. Of course it's going to happen because you created something that is essentially outside of regulation. And also if it's essentially untraceable, then no big surprise that criminals are going to use it because it serves their purposes a lot better than the regulated systems that the banks are operating or the other payment operators. So, and this is, it's a hard thing to get around when what you have is only, for example, a decentralized blockchain. As good as they are in some respects, they simply are not compatible with many of the environments that you have to comply with to attract commercial entities. And this has been our focus, to try to figure out how can we keep the excellent qualities of a proper blockchain that actually works properly with the requirements that actual commercial operators, real retail operators, whatever, cannot get away from, because they actually operate in the real world with real customers that are also subject to legislation. And one of the things that ultimately any commercial actor will want to know is, if I invest in this, if I actually commit to using this infrastructure, am I going to get in trouble legally? And actually, one of the things that is getting a little bit scary is if you look at how the fuzzy liability that payment providers have now, means that you can't really be sure. Then we get into the debunking issues that actually hit us as well. That you pick some payment operators and everything looks fine and you've tested everything, and then you open up your shop and then you get your account gets suspended by the payment operator on day one, and you have to regroup, and it's an absolute disaster. It's in one sense understandable, because if there is a poorly specified liability on the payment operator side, yeah, of course they're going to make a subjective call.
Yeah, they're going to pick the lowest risk route forward.
Yes.
And sorry, just to bring you back a second, what was the expression that was used by the court about willful something?
Acceptance.
Willful acceptance. So,
or at least that was the expression Grok used. So I'm assuming that's a.
Well, there's a contrasting term, which is willful ignorance, which is which is displayed by Christine Lagarde and the IMF when she goes around criticizing blockchain as being a tool for money laundering. Because the reality is, on Groot, the open source, governance-free resource layer that sits at the heart of Gajumaru, actually everything is transparent. The same as is in Bitcoin. An unadulterated transaction within Bitcoin is entirely traceable right back from Genesis. And so actually an actual blockchain is an extremely poor money laundering tool. However, it still doesn't solve the issue that people are going to have in the real world of being able to provide proper accounting, reporting, taxation, accounts, and so on, and to be able to operate within a compliant framework. Now, how things will emerge in terms of the ongoing management of fiat currency, or rather mismanagement of fiat currency, the dilution of human capital through money printing. Forgive me. Many of these things are a bit like Dimitar pointed out earlier. They're hidden because we don't have a reference point. He said, well, what's the alternative? Because as things stand, we have two colliding forces. We have the corporatist agenda, which Jeff Bezos neatly encapsulated with "your margin is my profit," which is to control everything, to have all of the rent-seeking intermediation controls, and to be able to monetize those rent-seeking positions. And essentially, a rent-seeking position is a place where you get to impose outsized costs upon your users relative to the risk that you're actually taking, which is virtually nil. And of course, the wonderful part of the duality between the corporatist and the statist position is that when the corporatists abuse that so terribly and thoroughly that the statists will then bail them out with massive money printing, we have the global financial crisis of 2008. In some ways precipitated by poor policy being driven down from the government and being pushed onto the financial operators. But when we're looking at these things, the lack of a reference point has allowed money printing to go on fairly unabated, and the transition of that money printing into our lives is quite slow. It's not immediate, therefore we don't have the immediate moment of walking into the shop and seeing that a bag of tomatoes is now 20 where yesterday it was 5, because there's now 4 times more money in circulation. It takes time for that to flow through, but ultimately real assets retain their to mark to market, as it were, value, where human capital is constantly diminished. I'm going off track here because the point that we're getting at is that the whole design of an associate chain framework within the Ripper analogy resource infrastructure, that's the infrastructure. The resource is Groot, but the infrastructure layer are all these associate chains. And the way that we've designed the Gajumaru is specifically to allow anybody to come along and build whatever they want on the associate chain level. We don't have any control or governance over that. But what we expect to happen there is mostly sovereign actors, large industries, maybe even just banks, come along and say, actually, this could provide us with a really good tool. So if you were a bank and you wanted to implement a new banking system, a new database system, and you wanted to be able to interlink that with a global currency such as the Gaju, and within frameworks that allow all of that in communication, a little bit like the Global Layer 1. And I think you and Dimitar looked at Global Layer 1, which is an initiative by the Monetary Authority of Singapore to create a framework for the transaction of assets between different jurisdictions, which Funnily, when I was listening to the guy from the Monetary Authority of Singapore describe this at Point Zero in Zurich last year, I couldn't help but think this is, he's saying that we're going to design the solution set from a paperwork and process perspective, but the technology doesn't yet exist for us to do this. And I was thinking, well, actually, the technology does exist for you to do this. It's called the Gajumaru. But you two looked in quite some detail at what Global Layer 1 were trying to do, and how what their ambitions are would be served by the structure of the Gajumaru. So maybe elucidate some of that, because that feeds into what we're talking about here. That you've got regulated actors within regulated jurisdictions, and each jurisdiction in their model effectively becomes an associate chain in ours. It then has subsets within that would be the different banks who are operating with different clients, which could just be SQL databases, as we point out. And that is then able to interface with each other because the native interoperability is there from Groot, but the interconnectivity is driven by choices that each jurisdiction makes as to how it will operate with other jurisdictions and what standards, which is not to do with the technology, it's to do with the standards of how something is described, are implemented.
So, yeah, we've looked at so many different solutions or ideas that they tend to blend together. It's kind of hard to remember exactly which competitor was what. As I recall with Global Layer 1, one of the big bugs was that the assumption was that there is going to be a very benevolent committee, of course, that's going to decide who gets to join.
Like the IMF, for example, who will
the interconnect
so
layer.
nicely.
And one of the things that what I was thinking before was also the thing about what Dimitar said, what is the alternative? One of the things that we think that I think that Gajumaru really provides is a set of technical alternatives, technical solutions that actually allow you and really encourage you to do the right thing. And as engineers, I think that's about the best you can hope for, because the solution that will try to force compliance on you is going to be abused, because it's going to be a magnet for the worst people ever, and the exact people that you don't want to fight for control are going to be the ones to fight for control, because you provided the levers for them. And one of the big things, I think, for example, we talked about the fuzzy liability of payment operators. I guess one issue there is the conflation of responsibilities, that the payment operators that provide a nice, well-regulated experience in your local market are also the ones that provide the global connectivity of payments, which means that you get the card that works so well in your local market is also the one you can use in Australia if you ever go there. And then when you are both sort of your local convenience and the global payment rail, and it's very tempting to say, for example, when you're launching a war on terror, that, hey, those payment operators, if we put requirements on them to also detect all the bad guys out there and make sure that they cannot use the infrastructure, we can go one step further and say, well, you guys, you have to be proactive. We shouldn't even have to tell you who the bad guys are. You should detect it. You should shut them off. That would be more effective. Then suddenly they are on the hook to scrutinize everyone and subjectively decide who gets to use their infrastructure. I noticed, for example,
that it doesn't actually work, because there are all these rules, and yet
Yeah.
Trillions of dollars of money laundering occurs every single year, according to any one of the authorities you want to point at, whether that's the UN, the World Bank, or the IMF. They all make it obvious that something between $2 and $7 trillion a year are laundered through the existing banking system. But Dimitar, you were going to say something to that.
You have the issue that, for example, the other day it was I saw in an article that Stripe actually has been building their own layer 1 blockchain.
Well, layer 1 is like that thing in Oprah. You know, you turn up to the Oprah show and everyone in the audience gets one. So now the people have worked out that
Stripe
a layer
actually
1
has
is
an
really just
impressive
a control mechanism with the pretense of decentralization. Everybody wants one.
So Stripe actually has an impressive portfolio of crypto-related services. Yet one of the reasons why they may rug pull you is that your service is crypto adjacent. Which is
rug pull us.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is very convenient for them, of course. And they don't necessarily have to tell you why they decide to debank actors that are actually competitors to them, which is where things get sticky. And
you were going to say something there.
Yeah, my point is associate chains are by no means immune to any of those problems, actually. You can have inflation. So if country A, a national bank of country A comes and says, we're making a social chain with our native currency, and they decide to just print more, we as a society have no way of stopping them doing that. They can do whatever they want.
We have no way of stopping them because, as you point out, all the tools, all the tooling for building an associate chain to whatever design the creator wants it to be is there for them to do. The interesting thing, though, would be that now you would have a reference point of contrast.
Exactly. And since the Groot is decentralized and free, and it's not subject to any regulation, it will be stable and inflation free, essentially. And it will be the intermediary between all different associate chains. So even if someone decides to print coins, native coins, not Gajumaru, they cannot print Gajumaru. That will be for their own peril, and this is going to have a disciplinary effect for everyone.
Yes, it will. And this is actually a really interesting aspect of the whole idea of the Gajumaru as a complete picture. Because as you pointed out earlier, that isn't currently an alternative. We are stuck dealing with a fractured, fragmented set of infrastructures with rent seekers that run those infrastructures and the interconnections between them. We are stuck with central banks printing money and essentially selling out our futures for today's convenience. And we don't see these things because we don't have a point of contrast. And I think the really interesting contrast between Groot and the associate chains is that that contrast will be obvious and immediate. If you decide to print twice as much money today, the Groot, the Gaju, will immediately double in value against your currency, and this will be obvious and immediate to everybody's eyes. So actually, the discipline that it would then force upon sovereign states not to abuse their citizens is actually a really, really interesting aspect of this whole idea of the Gajumaru. It's on the one hand respecting the fact that states are going to want to have their own structures, their own rules, regulations, who they want to connect with and how they want to connect with them and so on. But on the other, to introduce that which has been missing, which is a reference point that allows the populace within that nation to say, well, hold on a second, what you're trying to do is actually egregious, and we're not going to accept that because we do have an alternative. It's maybe not as slick and fast as using the SQL database that is made available to us in the Republic of Kathmandu, but it is something that we can use as an alternative. So if you start to make the Kathmandu dollar something that you just print willy-nilly, we'll start trading in Gajus instead, thank you very much. Because the Gaju is also native to every piece of the infrastructure within the Ripper and Gajumaru framework. I think it's a topic that we should actually explore as a discussion, hopefully with some other people as well around this, that what might follow from the Gajumaru being implemented and utilized at associate chain level is that transparency which is absent from the existing system and arguably undermines democracy because people don't have the reference points to see with their own eyes what is really happening. So they listen to CPI and PPI, consumer price index and producer price index news on the TV, for example, and they don't really understand, because it's hidden from them, what those are the outcomes of. And actually they are the outcome of money printing, but the slowing of that impact into the economy through the devaluation of human capital, which ultimately ends up trickling into CPI and PPI.
Yes, and I guess in a sense you could say that the thing that Gajumaru brings to the table is sort of free market dynamics on the global stage,
and accountability,
where
through having that contrast.
So interestingly, just like Dimitar said, providing the ability to have associate chains being compatible with regulation, every bad example of stupid regulation will be possible on associate chain as well. What will be hard is to lock people into having to use that particular chain. It will be harder than it is now. And conversely, on a properly decentralized proof of work blockchain like the Groot, any stupid thing you can do on a blockchain that regulators don't like will be possible to do on the Groot as well.
Yes,
possibly, unfortunately.
But it also becomes obvious. Again, just as abuse of the
Yes.
associate chain regulations and rules becomes obvious, so does somebody acting in a deceitful way. The old expression, and Craig, you'll be familiar with this, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and swims like a duck, guess what? It's a duck. So in the context of Tornado Cash and all of the tumblers, and actually just take a moment, one of you, to explain, I think Dimitar, you actually explained it very well for Peter earlier, what a tumbler is. But all of these things have as their object purpose the facilitation of illicit trade. Because when they talk about privacy isn't really what they're trying to provide. It may be what they have the pretense of providing, but who is their actual customer? So, Dimitar, you explained earlier to Peter what a tumbler is, so perhaps do it again for the audience here.
I believe that was Suf, but essentially, tumbler is exactly what it sounds like. You put your coins into a common pool of coins, and then anonymously you receive a letter that says that you can withdraw this much from the common pool. So everyone puts in, all the traces are lost, and suddenly different people withdraw different amounts out of that, which anonymizes the origin of your coins. Suddenly your coins are freshly coming from a tumbler and nobody knows if they came from illicit activity or honest activity.
Actually, you're right. It was Ulf who illustrated it. Forgive me. So Ulf, the way that Dimitar just explained it, the way he explained it earlier in summation is, and actually my analogy was a tumble dryer, that you come in with a specific asset which has a traceable history, as in on the blockchain. It goes into the tumble dryer with lots of other ones, and in a different channel, you share the information to somebody else that allows them to claim that value out of the tumble dryer. So the whole thing becomes anonymous. So actually, maybe you should redo the example you gave earlier for Peter Santosh.
Well, so I guess the part of that was that the claim receipt that you get, essentially, that I put in this much, that means I can take out that much, but that's anonymous. So then I can back channel that receipt to somebody else in an untraceable way, and then they can anonymously claim the tokens I put in. And yeah, and I guess as Jarvis pointed out, in Australia, this whole concept is illegal, actually. They have decided to outlaw it completely. And I guess also the Tornado Cash verdicts do illustrate that the governments, the different regulated markets, they can actually come after you if you did in the unregulated space, and they will. There are different ways that if you're an honest actor who decides to try that out, one highly predictable outcome is that the banks will not touch you with a 10-foot pole, which means you can no longer do banking, which means you're essentially shut out from doing business in the regulated space. And this is a huge problem overall in the blockchain community. It's like it's almost a binary choice between being compliant with regulation or just being dark web, essentially. That everything that's done on your blockchain is more or less shady.
Well,
and this is where I think we actually provide an architecture that can separate these things. So also as a user of the Gajumaru, you can choose which associate chains you operate on. You can have a market that runs entirely on the associate chains that are actually compatible with the restrictions you're under as, say, a Swiss citizen or an American citizen or a Japanese citizen. And the Groot actually, or an unregulated associate chain, could be an interesting alternative for failed states where there actually isn't any useful currency or any useful regulation for that matter, and which is another thing where blockchain currency can actually be an alternative that actually works, where essentially the existing government currency is no longer useful.
Well, that's
because
you don't need to be a failed state. That's pretty much most of the emerging economies of the world. I mean, the whole thing with Malay and Argentina was that Argentina had been experiencing absolutely colossal amounts of inflation through financial impropriety for some time. And that's true in many African and South American and indeed Asian countries where you've seen massive spikes in inflation and then massive collapses in asset values. As a result of nobody having any faith in the financial system. Coming back to the whole privacy thing. So what we've established is that associate chains provide a tool set for the existing financial system to work, albeit to work with the control function of having a contrast, which is an open, free exchange mechanism. There is, as you alluded to just now, the alternative that somebody could actually create an associate chain on the Gajumaru with no governance and no means of profiting from that chain that could provide a privacy function. But ultimately, it's going to come back to this question of, are they actually providing privacy or are they in fact facilitating illicit activity? Because that's what it seemed to me from the reading that I saw of the materials you provided about Tornado Cash, that was actually the nub of the issue. They did have governance and they seemed to be actively encouraging or willful acceptance of where the majority of that flow is coming from, North Korea and crime. And so I believe North Korea washed quite a bit of the money they had stolen as part of their industrial hacking. Craig, you know quite a bit about that.
Yeah, there's there's a whole sort of sub market, and so North Korea is basically banned from doing business anywhere. So one way that they can't do normal trade with most countries. So one way that they can get money is by honing what they view as a militarily useful skill, which is, electronic espionage, various cracking techniques. It's not always just to steal data. Sometimes it's to get into a control system or whatever. But in the course of practicing or refining those techniques, they will target a company, lock it down, and then ransom them and say, you guys can't use your factory unless you pay us off. But the way they want to get paid off is they want to get paid off somewhere that's external to North Korea, because they don't have money to do any operations outside of Korea unless it originates there. So now, of course, if you just paid money to a North Korean held bank account, then it's kind of easy for the State Department to go, hey, that's, obviously something that we're going to freeze that because that's easy. So instead, if they can get paid in a form of crypto, and that crypto has a context in which it can be laundered, then that works. Then that can be converted to fiat somewhere, like way somewhere else, and spent any way that North Korea wants to try to fund foreign operations that they're running, like in more hacking. So the hacking is a self-feeding,
or
it's
a
self-leaking
five-star
ice cream cone
hotel
from
in
North
which
Korea.
you're told you're not allowed to provide negative feedback. But
Oh, you're right. That's right. Yeah, come visit North Korea. By the way, negative Yelp reviews will be prosecuted. It's like the funniest. It's the funniest little twist that they put in. But anyway, but that's a big operation that they do, and a lot of this is one of the problems in geopolitics with creating a genuine pariah that everybody isolates, is that there's no path back to normalization, and then all the paths to bootstrap espionage operations become profitable, and that becomes its own business angle. And then they kind of don't want, like, the higher ups don't really want to not be a pariah anymore, because they're incentivized to like double down on this, the crazy path. So if you if you isolate any country too much, you wind up getting a split in the world instead of a temporary penalization and then rectification. If you create a genuine pariah, there's no path of normalization back. If you leave no paths of redemption open, you eventually alienate everybody, and now you're the pariah. And that's a problem that's happening. The Western structure is kind of doing that to itself right now in weird ways. And this is why when I was in a weird unit before, we used to always joke about people that were consumed by the delusion of control, that you don't really have control over anything. Suicide's always an option, so is failure. And if everybody decides to fail together in this other direction, you now are alone. So you got to be careful. Of course, this is like a geopolitical conversation now, but that's, this, the North Korean hacker thing, that's a real thing. And it's not just them, but that's a self-licking ice cream cone of its own.
Well, look, thank you for that. The thing you touched on there is the weaponization of the dollar. And through the weaponization of the dollar, actually its diminution as a global resource, if it ever was one. Arguably it wasn't. I mean, if you are Swiss or from Liechtenstein, you will know very well that the US government uses the US dollar as a weapon. It has been doing that for a very long time. If you're Iranian, you'll know extremely well how that works. And now the Russians know as well. The problem is, as you just identified, is that all of these different actors, as they emerge and become bigger and stronger economies in their own right, are beginning to look at the issue of, well, hold on a second. If I want to go from Brazil to Russia to do trade, I have to go from Brazilian money to American money, and then American money to Russian money. The communication channel of value is the US dollar, and that can be shut down at any time on the whim of whoever's in government in the USA. That perception that this is something that is being used as a weapon is what's leading to the conversations about having a BRICS type currency. Now, that conversation is obviously deluded because they haven't looked at the euro and what happens when you have a unifying currency but no unifying country underneath it with varying needs and obligations and requirements. Coming back to the whole structure of associate chains, Groot, and privacy, what can somebody do in a legitimate way in order to preserve their privacy in the context of Groot? So, for example, I have an account with 1,000 Gajus in it, and I don't really want everyone else in the world to know, anonymized as the account itself might be, I don't really want everyone to know how much money I have in my account. How might that kind of privacy that we take for granted in the current banking system, that we think that nobody else knows how much money is in our account, we ignore the fact that everybody in the bank does. But sitting here in the room today, I would have no means of inquiring how much money is in Ulf's bank or Dimitar's bank or Craig's bank, nor they mine.
So
how might that functional privacy that we take for granted be accomplished within the context of blockchain, other than the illegitimate or the adherence to the existing system? Is there a third way, to unfortunately use Tony Blair's wording? In fact, Bill Clinton's as well. They were both very fond of the third way. And we won't mention Epstein in that third way either. I can see Craig dying to
if there is a specific third way you're aiming for, it eludes me right now, since, I mean, essentially, like we said, you Tornado Cash on Groot as well, because all the expressive power on that Ethereum
that would
has
be illegitimate. That would be illegitimate, and obviously illegitimate, because it has those governance features. But I suppose it's going to be an interesting thing to see what emerges on Groot. Does somebody come up with an idea of creating a privacy chain that actually is about privacy and isn't about money laundering?
Right. So on creating an associate chain that implements some level of privacy and moving your Gaju there, you can do it. On the Groot, well, it becomes a question of, yes, there are technical ways to achieve it. They may end up being illegal for the same reason that Tornado Cash was criminalized.
And it's great. We can't know if they would become illegal, is the trick, one of the tricky and sticky issues here.
Yeah.
But if you...
And it is one of the sticky problems when the regulators are trying to approach decentralized blockchains, what they call pseudonymity. It's sort of anonymous, but not fully. And as soon as you can tie an account to a physical person, then you can essentially unravel almost all the activity that is directly or indirectly connected to that account, until it gets into an exchange. Maybe that's the third way you were aiming for. The crypto exchanges essentially work like tumblers, because when you create an account in a crypto exchange, they own the keys to that account. So it's their account. So you graciously let them have your crypto.
Without the grace of them having any oversight whatsoever.
This is true. So there is this wonderful article about Bitcoin. It's called Bitcoin, Who Owns It, Who Mines It, Who's Breaking the Law, which I think gives a pretty good overview of the... it does mention that that it's actually a small fraction of activity on Bitcoin that's illegal. But it also mentions that about, in any given week, 80% of all the activity on Bitcoin goes through exchanges. And this is also where law enforcement loses track of criminal activity, because you can trace all the transactions as long as they are made on Bitcoin. But when they go into an exchange, it's essentially a black hole. It for enforcement purposes, it kind of works like a tumbler, like tornado cash, more or less. And as long as there is no regulatory oversight, you don't really know if money laundering is taking place, unless something happens like with FTX. They actually funneled a little bit too much funds out of the exchange. And then the internet called them on it, and the whole thing came crashing down. And then when that gave legislators a reason to look into it, because they had pretended to be a bank, but then failed to deliver on their...
They're all doing that. I mean, layer twos are essentially custodial banks and payment service providers without the grace of being regulated as either. What are they doing? They're expediting transactions on failed proof of concepts, Ethereum, and now more and more Bitcoin. And they are essentially creating an intermediary layer. Again, for all the people who never bothered to read the Bitcoin white paper and note even the headline, the title, which is a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, not a peer-to crypto bro to idiot electronic cash system. What you're seeing with layer twos, and there's an interesting conversation to have around layer ones on this as well, is that they are using the pretense of decentralized operations and smart contracts to say that they aren't doing these things, but actually they are. You do have to trust them. When you have something like Arbitrum and long cycles to actual settlement, the transactions are very quick, but actual settlement takes days. The opportunity for malfeasance and error is huge. So that's one part of it. But and the layer ones, as I like to point out to people, if someone were to take the new acts in America and actually apply them properly, many of the layer ones would fall foul of running financial systems that really the decentralization is merely a pretense. And there's quite a few that you could just list off the top of your head of which that is true. Then around that, you've got this issue, as you point out, of exchanges. And aside from paying the Trump campaign hundreds of millions of dollars to ensure that you get what you want out of the system, it's, as you point out, it is really, really egregious how they operate these things, because you don't actually own anything. It's mixed funds. I mean, this is exactly what we learned that in the US led to the 1934 Security Markets Act, which was that you can't have blended funds. You can't mix company funds with client funds. But that's exactly what the case is in all of these so-called exchanges. They're not really exchanges. They're more like central securities depositories, which in a traditional financial services context are the most heavily regulated of them all, because they are almost Genesis.
But they pinky swear.
I know, but and they pinky swear with both hands too. It's
like this.
Very special. Yeah, it's very special.
And of course, part of what has been the reality of especially small blockchains is, even if you come up with some really interesting how to attract users to your blockchain, onboarding is a huge problem, because if you're not listed on any of the exchanges, then it's almost impossible to acquire the currency of your chain so that people can start playing with the nice services that you offer. And
hold on, there's two parts to this. So the whole thing with being proof of stake is gameable. We've said this before, that anonymous proof of stake is highly gameable. But what's actually going on in the background, Dimitar and I think Craig, you both have direct experience of what goes on with this. And Ulf, I think you've seen some of it too, that the exchanges play this game knowing that you need to have some sort of a marketplace on which your fake token is able to be traded and transacted and given a value in the terms of something else rather than its buying power. the exchanges then take very large fees up front and all sorts of indemnifications. And Craig, you were talking about backdoors that they try and enforce as well, I think.
Basically, they'll come out with a deal that says, in the event that your chain ever has a compromise of any form whatsoever, you, in order to be listed, you agree to reimburse us whatever our losses might be and either just pay us outright or reset the chain to a safe state. Now, the whole point of a chain is nobody's resetting anything. But that's like a common thing to request, is like, oh, you guys will just fix the state and guide the correct fork to be the chosen one. And it's like, then that's not really. Now, the crazy thing, the light bulb that turned on the first time I ever saw this, it wasn't one time, just like every time. But the first time I saw that, it shocked me that could even be a thing that's requested. It means that it's so common in different chain projects that they're essentially permission chains in the background, that's even a thing that people ask for, that exchanges would ask for. So yeah, there's some shenanigans going on.
Not ask for, demand.
Well, yeah, not
Otherwise,
initially you think that you're talking to someone who simply doesn't understand how blockchains work. And
no, they do. They understand exactly
we're actually
how
a blockchain.
Fake
that is
work.
technically not possible by design. And then you go, oh, okay. That's the way it should be. But
light bulb. You go, oh, everyone's just full of crap all the time. Didn't realize that.
Silly us who actually designed the chain.
And there's an L1 for everybody in the audience, Oprah style. Dimitar, you, without naming names, you had direct experience of seeing this in action.
Yeah, so, we all were there. We all were in the boat, like Oof and Craig. But essentially, there were some exchanges that got burned by a non-technical issue of blockchain. And they said, you either reimburse us for our losses, so you're taking the risk for us, or we stop working with you. And their assumption was that the project has a way of printing coins out of thin air, which it didn't, of course. So they delisted it almost on every exchange out there. It's bizarre. It's bizarre how they're doing business. They're making profits and expect someone else to take the risk for them not being persistent in their expectations how a blockchain would work.
But isn't it then rather ironic? Go on, sorry.
You take all the risk, you give us all the crypto and give us all the fiat, and we pinky swear this won't go wrong. That's the deal.
This is what I was going to come to. The interesting thing around this is that we talk about the traditional financial economic system being fractured, fragmented systems, platforms interconnected by rent seekers, operated by rent seekers. But at least they have the grace of having somebody theoretically that is overseeing those operations. And that's what we are really being asked to trust in. That where you see trust, you should see regulation, you should see oversight. But what's actually happened in a context of crypto, and let's differentiate crypto from blockchain, because blockchain, as Ulf points out, is very, very different from what's actually happening in crypto and the so-called layer ones and fake blockchains. So what we're seeing emerge is a huge number of operators acting in a completely illicit way, where, much like the rent seekers in the traditional system, they want to be indemnified from any loss, despite the fact that they are gambling with other people's money. So they transfer all the risk to everybody else, and they seek to, as the expression goes from the global financial crisis in 2008, privatize profit and socialize risk. Except they're doing it to the chain. It will be very, very interesting to see what emerges, because Craig, you've talked about this very well in the past in team chats about how actually nothing real has been built in the so-called blockchain, actually crypto world at all. And wouldn't it be amazing to see what will happen when people wake up to the Gajumaru and understand that now you can do real business on chain, because all the things we've covered and discussed are true. You have an open resource layer that you can operate in, and that acts as a connective interoperable backbone between associate chains, which can be and will be, in all likelihood, operated by consortia of banks, sovereign states, consortia of different industries, and have at their root purpose the intent to impose governance and rules. Yeah, over to you.
Yeah, there's so the basic problem with crypto still is, I want to buy this cool T-shirt that I found online. How do I do it? I want to go down. There's a coffee thing down the road from my house. I want to go buy coffee beans with crypto. How can I do that? Well, you pretty much can't. And so it's pushed everybody into this funny place where instead of being digital cash or even currency at all, it's become, well, they've become gambling chips essentially. The mechanical horse race gambling. It's basically like which different coin you're holding is your horse number, and it's one of those mechanical things running around in a circle, and you're betting on it. That's kind of, the Ponzi coin game and the greater fool theory. Man, there's a lot of enormous fools that just keep chasing that. And the reason I say fools is there's no economic outlet for activity that's real. I can't go buy a watermelon and pay for it in Bitcoin. And there's so many practical reasons why you can't do that. And then on top of that, there's regulatory ones that usually don't make it illegal, but they make it practically impossible. And that's a very common thing that we run into with wacky financial rules, is that they don't make everything illegal, but practically speaking, everything's impossible to do. And finally, with the commercial focus we have with Gajumaru, because again, as Ulf said, we were like the naive, silly people in the blockchain world building a real one. I guess the most fascinating thing is that we've discovered through our own debunking episodes has been that if your goal is to go scam a bunch of people with a rug pull, that's super fine. There's a path straight to that. Go for it. You can start up
it's a well-oiled industrial machine.
That is like, what do they say? The bullet train to hell and stairway to heaven. Like, it's like you can just hop on the bullet train and go straight to fart coin territory. Everyone knows how to do it. They know how to run the hype machine. Everything's there waiting for you. If you have any celebrity whatsoever, you can just do this. Doing a real thing though, oh man, nothing has been built to do that. Nobody even knows how to build marketplaces that are backed with a real blockchain. Like the mechanics behind, well, we do because we built one, but there was no, like, you would think that with so much money that's flowed through crypto, at some point somebody would have come along and identified the problems, done what we've done, built a new blockchain that's proper, that really works for business, and then figure out what's the structure, what are the patterns that you have to uncover to make an online marketplace actually work with crypto, to make pay at the counter actually work with real crypto on chain. And I said on chain. I don't mean through some weird intermediary thing. I don't mean that you've given, some exchange your fiat and your crypto, and then they're going to, in the background in their database, they're going to do the transaction. That's the way every sort of kind of you're paying with crypto solution works right now. I would have thought that by now this would be solved, and we're finding that that's not the case. We're the first ones doing this. So what's going to happen? I don't know. But when people realize that you could just sell a bicycle online for on-chain crypto, and it's direct to you, there's no intermediary stuff going on, and that you realize, hey, I've got Gajus, I can go buy that bicycle right now. I don't know what's going to change, but I don't know can't predict the future, but whatever economic pressure has been waiting for crypto to become real is going to be unleashed, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens.
So I guess one problem is competing incentives. For example, a lot of things on blockchain are really tricky from a theoretical point of view. And if you're a crypto researcher, some of the solutions that we have ended up with aren't sexy from an academic point of view. Like, for example, our associate chain connectors. I mean, if you can do something really complex with snarks, all kinds of weird zero knowledge proof roll-ups, and man, you can write a number of papers about that. Our associate chain connector points, not so much. They are deliberately simple, partly because you need to, for one thing, convince regulators that they obviously work as intended in a way that actually make associate chains obviously regulatable. That has been really a core mission for us, that it shouldn't just be possible, it should be apparent that it can work. And so that's not quite as sexy. So it's not a very attractive career if you want to make a name for yourself in crypto research. And that's one of the unfortunate disconnects often between academia and industry, where the stuff that industry solution problems that industrial engineers want solutions to are often really messy in a practical sense, but not necessarily so sexy from a theoretical point of view. And actually proving that they work in the real world is 90% of the work. But it's not what you get awarded or rewarded for in academia. Because it means that you're going to spend 90% of your time trying to convince the industrial actors out there that your solution actually works in the real world, whereas and only a fraction of that trying to publish a paper that's interesting enough to give you brownie points in academia.
Look, to bring this home, because you're right in saying that the incentive from an academic perspective is to create complexity and say, how clever am I? And have all of your colleagues go, oh, you're so very clever. But the reality is clever is not necessary, where obvious and simple will solve the problem. And it's that classic issue. So, you know, when I tend to think in terms of images as well. And whenever I think about crypto, the image that springs to mind, Craig touched on it earlier, is the deer hunter. And I can't remember whether it was Walken or Voigt that was the one pulling the trigger, playing Russian roulette. But before it gets to that, you see all these people gambling with wild passion over cockroaches racing. And that, when I think of crypto, that's what I think of. A whole bunch of essentially gambling addicts gambling on which cockroach is going to win the race, because that's all it is. I mean, if you look at what Bitcoin has become, it's, I used to refer to it as Betcoin because it was the Lord and Savior of number go up, but it ceased to be a gambling tool and is now a straight up open Ponzi scheme. But when you start looking at all these meme coins and things, they are literally just gambling slips where what you're really doing is saying, if I pick up enough gambling slips on the floor of the racetrack, I will find a winning ticket. And that's essentially the game that's being played with these things. And for some reason, people are actually engaging in this. But when people talk about blockchain adoption, which is a different thing from cryptos, I think we're trying to establish, it's a bit of a desert. There's lots of projects that have sort of happened, but failed. I mean, we looked at some of them. The whole thing that they tried to do with supply chain provenance in Walmart in the States. Why are they failing? They're failing because actually there isn't an actual blockchain that actually works, that you can genuinely say, I can trust the message, not the messenger. And I think the excitement I have with the Gajumaru is that we really have something. It's an actual blockchain that actually works, minting real money that really works. And that phrase may sound provocative, But anybody that's ever told me, oh, that's, you can't say that, I've challenged. Say, well, okay, well, tell me why I can't say that. Well, because of X. And then I point out why. Oh, yes, you're right. And then they point out A, and I say, well, what about B? And whether that is anonymous proof of stake being the essential mechanism by which you have the capacity to collude between actors and then essentially decide what something does or doesn't do. You see that expressed in so-called layer ones. You see that being expressed in DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations that are not decentralized and certainly not autonomous. It's going to be really interesting to see how the adoption of the Gajumaru does exactly what Craig talked about, that there is this latent commercial desire to use something. And you talked about this in the last video, that many of the people who've come in to be early miners are actually SMEs. And there is this latent desire to break away from what we have, which is this set of fractured, fragmented platforms that are controlled by rent seekers and interconnected by other rent seekers, or sometimes the same rent seekers, and get toward what blockchain long promised, which is an open base upon which we can all transact with one another, trusting the message, not the messenger. It is going to be phenomenally interesting to see how that explosion occurs. It is that inflection point that will occur. It's not when, it's not if, it's when. And the other aspect to it is, as you start to see associate chains emerge, because it's the obvious solution for the implementation of something like global layer one, it's the obvious solution for somebody to instantiate a national currency that's in digital form. It's going to be very interesting to see how, for the first time, the contrasts play in, that now the individual on the street can clearly see, oh, hold on a second, the Central Bank of Kathmandu has decided to print more money. And now all of a sudden, the Gajus in my wallet are worth twice as much as they were yesterday. Why? Because there's an immediate transition. Immediately, the world is going to go, oh, no, there's twice as much money there in that system. So the value hasn't changed. It's just there's twice as much of it. And those disciplines, I think, are going to be real game changers in terms of trying to restore the context that we have taken for granted, that we live within a liberal democracy and that these things are all working and there's proper accountability. And what we've been discovering, especially for the last 25 years, I'd argue, is that there's very little real accountability. Any closing thoughts from any of the three of you on all of the above?
That last bit there about sorry?
Go ahead, Craig.
Oh, that last bit about, so there's all these potential uses of blockchain because it's a distributed ledger technology. The distributed ledger use itself has been explored somewhat by industry, and none of those projects have worked out. The problem with all those projects, the reason that they never work out isn't because they make a bad chain or whatever. It's because the currency of those chains, if those chains are only used for ledger purposes, the currency on the chain that's supposed to make it work has no economic outlet. So it's not actually a currency. So you're not staking anything. If you're in an industrial chain where every actor in your industry has to stake some certain amount of whatever the coin is, so that's your penalizing factor if somebody becomes a bad actor. And now all the shippers are going to agree to log provenance and transfers and so on the same shared ledger. If you're going to do that, you have to have real money that you can go buy shoes with to be the penalty bearer. You can't just use some made up token whose only utility is being a staking coin. That doesn't make any sense, because that staking coin's got no reason for being aside from just being a stake thing. So you can be a bad actor and trash the coin, be like, I don't care, I couldn't buy anything with it anyway. Well, that all changes when the Gaju is, that's why the Gaju is carried by all associate chains. So just as you were talking before about the hierarchy of chains, there is a hierarchy, but it's only in the context of each currency. And as we've discussed already, you can have multi-currency chains. So the pinnacle of some other currency chain structure flows towards wherever the mint for this other thing is. Because they're all tied together by the Gaju, though, if you were to create a staking chain, an associate chain, it's a staking chain. It's not anonymous staking. It's known actor staking. The operators they put up stake to become operators. That may be part of an internal industry agreement to, make sure that nobody can go back and backdate fake serial numbers on car parts or something, so nobody can counterfeit them in the future. That works if they're staking Gajus, because Gajus mean something, because they have an economic outlet elsewhere. So that all changes things radically. That changes the whole proposition with regard to these, the ledger uses, the data ledger uses of blockchain. So we don't know where that's going to go, but that's a thing that will open up also. All this kind of unravels by actually simplifying things and saying, let's get back to having a currency be like a currency. And then if that's true, all these other things that have been theorized also suddenly become true and available. I think this is going to be interesting. This is going to be really cool. We can actually open this technology up properly. But the missing piece was that I can't just go buy shoes with crypto yet.
And therefore, there's no real penalty to my actions. It's all spurious.
Yeah, it's all just.
You could add, I guess, that the step towards making an associate chain that's actually compliant with regulation, the main part, I guess, could be that if you are already an actor who meets the requirements in this space, say you're a bank, you have all the infrastructure in place, all the routines in place to be compliant with regulation. The thing that the associate chain gives you is that all the moving parts are under your control. So for example, transaction selection in blocks, if you run it as a permission chain, what would be needed as an addition compared to, say, the Groot software base is you will use a different transaction selection filter where you could actually, say, do blacklist checking, whatever, and deny certain transactions that don't meet the criteria, whatever they may be. Maybe you have a requirement that all accounts should provably belong to actual citizens in your country or something. Then that is easily verifiable.
The design
choices you apply.
The design choices around that interface with Groot are fundamental to how the whole thing would work. You dictate what you will accept in and what you will allow to go out, and how you will do those things.
But the hard part is clearing the bar as an actor that has earned the trust of the finance inspection within your economic market.
I'm not so sure about that. Actually, I think if you look at how banking
at least as a bootstrapping
work,
thing.
Yeah, yes. But if you look at how banking technology stacks work, there's code in there from the 1970s. I remember talking to a consultant on financial systems from IBM, and he showed me a polling map of all the different servers that were polled in order to provide one simple statement to a customer on their mobile phone. How much money is in my account? And there were 27 different servers that were polled in order to get that data and present it correctly. And it blew my mind, because it really made me realize just how cumbersome the existing financial infrastructure actually is, and how the banks talk about that infrastructure being a core asset, but I actually think it's a core liability, and it's an ongoing liability that everything else has to compensate for. So
this
I think
actually
the whole
makes
thing
compliance
of associate
much harder.
chains,
yes,
yeah, I think it does. But I think the whole thing of associate chains, if you're talking to a regulated actor who wants to be, who really wants to make a step change, their capacity to build de novo on an associate chain linked into Groot is actually such an attractive option, because all of a sudden you can embrace the transparency, albeit that you put the cover of, well, we're a regulated entity, we're trusted by our customers, we are regulated by a proper regulator of global standing. And on that basis, we're then going to run effectively a state channel within that system. And I think
This is
that
true.
opportunity is massively, massively attractive if the big financial actors were to understand it, because it would mean that they could leave all of that legacy architecture behind. Dimitar, anything to add before we close?
Oh, I don't think so. You're
Okay.
really into details.
Okay, with that, thank you very much, everybody. We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.
Okay.